So this PowerPoint this week is going to talk about the historical thinking skills that's in the new framework for the APUS history classroom. I think what's really important to really focus in on and teach to the kids is that this is really the cornerstone of this new class. In the past, the historical facts were always put into the context of historical thinking skills, but now we're even more conscious about this, and this becomes sort of our central way of doing the entire class. And as we said in previous PowerPoints, the facts that we teach are really illustrative of these deeper historical thinking skills we want the students to learn. And one of the things I like to impress upon the students is that this is not only a good way to learn, it also helps them for the AP test at the end of the year because the entire test is structured around these skills. So, the advanced placement thinking skills. The major ones that we're talking about in APUS history are, first of all, comparison and contrast, and then cause and effect, change and continuity over time, periodization, and synthesis, and contextualization. Now, here's what I want people to really think about when they look at all of these thinking skills. When I first started teaching this new framework, I had learned about it and I was very excited about it. And then I started the year and I realized, oh my gosh, there are so many thinking skills that kids have to learn, so many possibilities for essay writing. A friend of mine recently said, though, if you really think about it, there are only two things that we do in history, which I thought was a little bit strange to say something like that, considering how complex history is. But he said, if you really think about it, we ask two questions in history. We ask, first of all, why did people do stuff? And secondly, how does that stuff compare or contrast to previous things that people did in other eras? Now, I'm actually going to add on a third category to what my friend said, and I'm going to say that contextualization is really kind of at the background of history, or at our foundation of history. But if you really think about it, this is what we do in history. Cause and effect, why did people do things? Comparison and contrast, how does that look similar and different between today and the past? And then last up, contextualization, how did the context influence the way people did things in the past? So, methodology. So, the way that I like to teach the historical thinking skills, and oftentimes the way you're going to hear how most people do this, is to start with something personal for the students. A lot of times if we start too much in the abstract, the students lose focus with that. So start with something personal and make that easy to understand. Have the students work in small groups so they can get their head around these new types of skills they have to learn. And then once they've done some kind of practice, discuss those principles and skills, do what we call debriefing, where the kids talk about how they applied those principles and skills, then apply it to a particular historical example, and then have the students again work in small groups when they're applying it to history so that it's comfortable, they can talk to one another, get a sense of this, discuss those principles and skills, and then have the students practice it on an individual basis. Contextualization. So you probably have heard of this professor, but just in case if you haven't, there's a Stanford professor who works both in history and in education. He's written a lot of really important books, I think, on these kinds of issues, and his name is Sam Weinberg. And Sam Weinberg is an amazing guy. He came out once to talk to some of us at the AP grading. He's absolutely hilarious, very smart guy, and if you ever want to get in touch with him, because I've tried, email him up at Stanford, and he will get back to you really quick. He's really good about doing that. He wrote a book recently called History and Other Unnatural Acts, and his point was that history really is like learning a foreign culture. A lot of times the way we approach history is just make that first leap, which is sort of like synthesis and saying, oh yeah, it's very similar to us in these ways. But when you really think about it, people who acted in the past acted differently. And so we have to learn them as if we are learning a foreign culture. So the question for my students would be something like this, and this is how I start off with contextualization. And this actually comes from a personal example that happened to me in high school. And I would say, why is it okay if you wear your swimsuit at the beach, but not in class? I know it sounds really funny, but this happened to me a long time ago. I was in the theater program, and I remember one of my fellow theater people who was in the program said at the time, we were teenagers and we were kind of foolish. And so we said at the time, why is it that in an hour from now we're going to be down at the beach and we can wear our swimsuits, but we can't do that here in the theater, or we can't do that just walking around? What's the big deal with that? And at the time, as a student, I thought that was a pretty brilliant question. Of course, the answer is context. Yeah, it's okay to wear your swimsuit down at the beach because the context allows for that. But it's not okay to do that in other areas because the context doesn't allow for that. So we start to talk about this a little bit. First they get into their groups, they talk about it a little bit, and we say, look, the difference is this. There's a time, there's a place, and there are ideas that influence people's behavior and that are accepted as social norms. And that's why we're not allowed to wear our swimsuit in other places, but at the beach it's acceptable. So we point out then the differences and similarities historically for context, and we talk about how, if context influences our fashion statements, then context might influence a lot of other things that people do as well. And so we talk about how that's the case. And so a good historical contextual question you might have the students look at in small groups is, would the founding fathers recognize America today? Or would they see it as significantly different? And if they do, what are the differences contextually between the founding fathers and today? I like to use this question, especially considering all the politics that are going on out there today, because when we really think about it, the founding fathers lived in a farming republic with a very small industrial base up in the Northeast. Good part of that republic was slave-going and agricultural, and at the time we had just put America together, and if you think about it, our main foreign policy was to remain neutral, to remain isolated from the rest of the world when it came to politics and military, not with economics. Economics, we were pretty engaged with the rest of the world. So when you think about all those differences, is there anything that we can say is similar between our time period and then? And that really opens up some great discussions with the kids about the differences, but our similarities and ideas as well. Comparison and contrast. So a big question we're asking in comparison and contrast is, how does the past resemble or differ from today? So the good news, and this is really the big good news over this, and it gets back to my friend's question, or my friend's statement about history, is that, once you learn these skills, they cross over so much because so many of these skills really are consolidated into those three big things that we talked about. So the good news is this: the skill transfers over into changing continuity and synthesis. So here's my question that I'll ask the kids as they work in their small groups. How do you compare and contrast with your first year, with your second year as a sophomore, junior, and what do you think you're going to be similar or different from in your senior years in high school? Now, once they've discussed that, you've debriefed it, then you can talk about historical events, issues, or regions for comparison and contrast. A good example might be this. How would we compare and contrast the empires at the very beginning of the colonization of America? So places like New France, New Spain, and New England. And here's what's so great about doing something like this. So we've started the kids off with comparison and contrast. They understand what we're supposed to be doing with that. We taught them context, so they understand that as well. And now you can jump right into the framework's big issues of New France versus New Spain versus New England. And there are clear comparison and contrast you can use here. For New France, they had the most amount of land, but they settled the land in a spread out way with military and trading. New Spain had a significant amount of land in North America, but probably the most amount of land when it came to Mesoamerica and Central and South America. Their big contrast is going to be the fact that they tried to proselytize to the people who were there, and they tried to have a Catholic New Spain in this area that exploited silver. And then New England's smallest area, but it's going to become the most dominant. Why? Big part of that contrast is the settlement of families. So this is a great way to introduce comparison and contrast both personally and then bring it into the historical sense as well. So the next one is periodization, or what we call turning points. So this is really about change over time types of questions. And you can encompass both change in continuity, cause and effect, and periodization together. And this is what makes this so great. One of my biggest concerns when I taught the class for the first time was, how am I going to teach all these different essays and then practice all these essays? There are 5 possibilities here. There's no way the kids are going to be able to keep up. But you can really overlap and bring these all together. Turning point essays, periodization essays include both change in continuity and cause and effect. So here's my question. What were the main turning points that you've had in your life up until now into high school? Now, when you ask the kids about this and you get them into a group and have them discuss this, my guess is what most of them are probably going to say is, here's what I did in grammar school, here's what I did in middle school, here's what I'm doing in high school. Now, here's what you get to do. Tell them, great, now I want you to go back and you're going to create a new turning points, but you're going to use a different criteria. So you can't use education as your way to divide up the way that your life has gone, but use some other criteria like changes in your family. That would be a possibility. Or maybe changes in the activity you do outside of school. So whether you're in sports and theater, speech and debate, art, what were the changes that brought that up? The reason why this becomes so important is now you're getting the kids to see that we organize our information by criteria, and the different ways you're organizing your criteria is going to affect your point of view. So we force them into doing this, reorganizing that information using a different criteria, and now we can start applying this into history. And if you think about it, that allows us to get into issues like historiography. So ask them, how did reorganizing the information change their viewpoint? Now, think about this for history for a second. A lot of times when historians make arguments in historiography, they might make the argument based upon ideology, or they might make the argument based upon economic conflict, or they might make the argument upon a variety of different types of conflicts, like racial and gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. What I want the kids to be able to see is that it depends on how you look at things, how you use that criteria as to how you will end up interpreting history. And then you can bring it back to their personal life and say, when you organized your information based upon your schooling, you came up with one type of way of looking at your life. When you organized it based upon family or based upon the extracurricular activities, you probably got a very different picture of how your life is working. That's the same way history works. So now one of the toughest skills that teachers are facing is this idea of synthesis. So one option with synthesis is to use an alternative category than what's in the prompt. So typically a prompt will ask something like, what happened here on a political level? Well, the students can say later on, here's what happened on a social level as well. They're adding on to it. They're providing that added value so they can get synthesis. The second option is to provide a comparison to another time period. So here's the way I would approach this on a personal level. You might say something like, what will get them into small groups and ask them, what will be the similarity between you now and 10 years from now? So this is a great question to ask if you think about it, because the students are looking past college. They're asking themselves what they would be doing at that point. And are they really the same person at that point, or have they changed dramatically? This kind of gets them out of themselves. They have to make some comparisons and contrasts between what they think is going to happen now and in the future. Now, one of the big points I want to put out to them, and this is a huge issue with synthesis that I really want to stress as a hint, be careful with them to stress what is peripheral and what is a core similarity. I can't tell you how many times I've had students do synthesis statements. They don't get the points for it, and they're really frustrated over that because they wonder, what is it that I have to do in order to get that similarity? What is Zucker going to accept? What I have to explain to them is that there's a difference between providing me a peripheral similarity and a core similarity. So think about that like with the personal example. If they say something to the extent of, I guess in 10 years from now, I guess I'll be educated. Well, that's true, just as much as they're getting an education now, but that's really peripheral. What I'd want to see is something more of a core similarity. So on like a personal level for them, that might be, right now I really have an interest in art, and in 10 years from now I can see myself really being educated in doing some kind of deeper level of photography. Now that's a core similarity. What about history? Well, in history, we could have something like, the Puritans attempted to establish a theocracy based upon a biblical republic. Today, we see in the 1970s, 1980s, a new evangelical movement that really believes that America needs to return back to a biblical basis. Now, there's a core similarity between Puritanism and between a movement of today. Also, you want to make sure the students provide an explanation for their choices. I can't tell you how many times in synthesis statements, students will just tell me what the similarity is, but they don't give me a reason behind the similarity. It's really important that they do that in order to get the points. So, the next big set of skills, of course, is the document-based question. And as you know, the document-based question is no longer about summary or paraphrasing. Students really have to provide analysis. So students are always going to be given 7 documents. They cannot summarize or paraphrase those documents. They must analyze and interpret the documents. They can use author, audience, point of view, or purpose. Now, one of the ideas that's come up of this is an acronym, and it's given by a guy named Bill Pulaski. Bill's great. He's a friend of mine. We used to do APUS history reading together at the National Reading. He now is involved with get5.com. So if you ever want to look him up that way, you can. He's a great teacher and just a great guy. And he came up with this great acronym to help students to remember this. And I think it's funny. And on top of that, it's really simple for the kids to remember. Now, just a quick warning, the kids are going to ask, where's the Y? And you always have to tell them it is pronounced happy, but it's not spelled happy. It's just a good way for them to be able to remember it. It's HAP-P, H for historical context, A, audience, P, point of view, and then last up, purpose. So here's an opening activity you can do to get the students into this. Give the students a current events article and assign them different points of view. Have them explain the points of view. So anything that's going on right now. I mean, this next year is going to be big with the presidential elections, or you could talk about the issue of terrorism in the Middle East. You could talk about immigration issues and assign them different points of view within the country as to who might have a different perspective off of this, and then have them debate who has the most correct interpretation. This allows them to get into point of view so that they can understand that just like in current events and history as well, we have to analyze where is somebody coming from, and it's not just what they're saying, but much more what is the purpose of what they're saying. So, some takeaways for these thinking skills. First of all, note that the test is moving away from summary and paraphrasing. Now the test is based on what we call the HOTS, the higher order thinking skills or historical thinking skills, and the themes. Students are going to see this in all parts of the test. So whether it's the multiple choice, short answer, DBQ, or long essay, it's going to be based upon the HOTS and the themes. And the test now is really about analyzing and what I call decoding, meaning taking a look at the context and using the context as a way to really be able to break things down and see how it influences the purpose of what these documents are asking, the purpose of what the multiple choice questions are asking.